When we review some of the past and look at some of these clubs, it is like a loss of innocence. So we have to tiptoe gently around what our real memories of these places are.
If you're young and active in a city at the time, the city takes on, and you take on, an awful lot of stuff, or maybe perhaps think that an awful lot is going on, that in hindsight might not be the case. But at the same time, without sounding nostalgic, this was the start of it.
It just kind of fell in at the right time, the right place, the right venue and stuff like that. Yeah, it was a really good time, really special.
After Ecstasy hit, the place exploded. Everyone wanted a piece of it. Everyone wanted to go out and dance. Everyone wanted to go clubbing, raving.
It was really egalitarian. You know, you'd actually go to a rave and it'd be all the classes mixing. And I really mean all the classes, like the upper class came out of the woodwork for that period.
It was definitely the age of dance music, the 90s. And I think it is right to be nostalgic. As things became more and more sophisticated, you know, it kind of lost something.
None of those clubs ever reached the heights that the underground clubs in the early 90s did. And they had no big name imported DJs on. They had a regular community going, and they had a guy who knew the crowd and loved his music, and they connected.
When you look back at the punk thing, like that first kind of few months before it went really commercial, I always found the interest. It was pretty straightforward and raw. I guess it's the emergence of the scene and people doing everything themselves.
Everyone be wearing tracksuits and runners, because you know, if you're going to be dancing all night, if you're going to be, you know, exercising, you need to be wearing comfortable clothes, like, you know. Most people be going out with their shirt and tie, going to a nightclub, whereas we were going for all nighter, like, you know. So you'd have your champion top and your tracksuit bottoms and your boot runners, this sort of stuff, and you certainly wouldn't be turned away because of the way you were dressed. Because you would stand out. You know, in the early days, it was a small enough crowd. You see someone walking down with a sun hat and a backpack, you know they were going to a rave.
And it spread rapidly. 2-3 years later, like it just spread like wildfire.
Here's some great shots from one of the last nights in Vickers before it got burnt down. So we're talking about late '87. Black and white shots by Sean Gilmartin. I love this one. You just don't know what's going on here. This is the last big night in Vickers, 4 nights before the place was burnt out. Okay, this is the coffee bar downstairs. It's Halloween. You can vaguely see dressing on the venue here. You can see the low ceiling here, ventilation system running along the side here. Really low ceiling, then mirrors down at the end. The back door, this is the front, the street end. There's a stage up here. What's beautiful about some of these photographs is that they're really rare because, of course, very few people, given the nature of this space, very few people wanted to be photographed. We're talking about a time when people were really only coming out of their sort of, you know, the ghetto, the sort of the closet ghetto.
It's really difficult to imagine the type of place that Temple Bar was, say, 30 years ago. Some parts of it were actually really dangerous. You just simply didn't wander down some of those dark back streets. I mean, there was extraordinary poverty. Almost every street was pockmarked by dereliction or by property owners who were land banking property and who didn't have the resources to develop it. And of course, there wasn't the legislation to compel them to develop it or whatnot.
There was the Viking rooms being built upon up in there in the corporation offices. And then they want to put a bus depot down here in the heart of the city.
it was Fowle Street because it was so derelict. So it made an ideal place. It was essentially a back alley. It made an ideal place for a lesbian and gay community centre at a time when homophobia in Dublin and in Ireland was as endemic as the poverty I'm trying to describe. A poet friend of mine from Finglas, John Grundy, used to refer to the Hirschfeld Centre as Fortress Found. It looked like it was totally grilled and barricaded.
Well, here we are at the site of what was the Hirschfeld Centre and Flickers. Now selling shoes.
What's interesting about that venue, not only was there a demand for people to actually dance their little socks off until all hours of the morning and really be taken on that fabulous musical odyssey and journey from 11 o'clock until 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. There was also something inherent in the fact that we were able to stay open so late, was that we're talking about a period when essentially, again, pre-ecstasy, and I can't overstate the significance of that, because it meant the authorities weren't wise to the subtext, the pharmaceutical subtext of dancing at the time, if that makes sense. And also clubbing hadn't become commodified.
Coming into somewhere like Flickers, it was just a whole new world. It was brilliant because it was, how do you explain it? It's like being reborn. When you're going out clubbing and you don't want the same 20 clubs in a row, we'll say up on Harcourt Street or Leeson Street at the time, all playing the same 40 songs. Down here, you came in and it was like a whole new world.
Dublin at that time, the mid-80s, there was nightclubs were like Leeson Street and a few places like that, and there was no kind of thing where you could go with young mates and experience the new sounds or whatever. Maybe McGonagall's around that time, there was a few Club Sandino maybe and that, and a few of the crossover hip-hop nights were emerging in that, but there was nothing where you could have a choice.
The sound system in the Hirschfeld Centre was really quite extraordinary. They had got it right from the beginning, and the reason they did was because, of course, Flickers, the dance club, was the cash cow on which the whole edifice was actually structured. The building was set up by a bunch of gay women and men with a grant from David Norris, a Trinity English lecturer who mortgaged his house at the time, to pay to set it up. And these people took a punt on the building, and then they used the dance club, interesting enough, to fund the mortgage, fund the services that it provided, but also to be the sort of social focus for gay people in a socio-cultural landscape where there were no alternatives in Dublin.
Flickers was the place that you would go to and you wouldn't hear the top 20. You would hear music you've never heard before, and you'd be spending half your time going up to the DJ going, what's that?
Some people who'd either done the gay party circuit in the States or had been to clubs like Paradise Garage, or they'd been to the Saint, venues that had seen how this operated. And of course, because it was a volunteer operation, what Flickers did was it had a record pool with a library behind the DJ booth. Everything's color-coded by year. You've got your 45s, your 7-inch singles, you've got your albums, and then the 12-inch single. You had a quick visual reference of the year, and then of course you have the details up here: title, artist, label, file number, the 839th 12-inch single, because there were albums and 45s there as well. And then of course it's BPM. It's handily BPM'd for you, so it tells you it's 116 BPM. Saturday night was hardcore dancing, and that was a place that tended to sort of seed all those interesting alternative mixes.
So you could experiment there. I used to play 12-inch instrumentals of James Brown with anybody doing speeches or raps over it, and we're talking nearly 30 years ago.
Dublin was okay back then. Like, people try to paint it as some kind of shitty rock wasteland. Everyone had a mullet and loved U2 or something. But there was loads of little pockets going on. There was little hip-hop things here and there, and then Northern Soul, Oisin Lunny and those guys doing. There was little pockets of all kinds. If you went looking for it, you'd find it. There's a guy called Tony Christie who used to work on Radio Dublin, and he had a pirate and he had a show from 1984 onwards. But about 85, they linked up with Abbey Discs, who, believe it or not, used to tape all the new 12 inches, record them on a cassette, and give the cassette to Tony of everything that was out that week on 12 inch, and then he would play the 12s on the station. So hip hop stuff, some of the earlier house things, Steve Silk Curley, Marshall Jefferson, this type of thing, before the acid thing really hit.
But he said, if you're in Dublin and if you're in a crew, call us, tell us how many is in the crew, give us your names, the name of the crew, blah, blah, blah. We'll try and, we'll put the information out at the end of the show. There must have been about 50 different groups of dancers in the Dublin area. So he said, well, look, why don't we all meet tomorrow at the Central Bank, 3 o'clock. I remember, well, I have the tapes, 3 o'clock at the Central Bank. And he says, bring your ghetto blaster and any money we make from busking will go towards your batteries. I turned up to the Central Bank the next day. I couldn't believe it. There was literally hundreds of kids.
It was around 87 or something that the Voodoo opened in McGonagall's. And all I remember, at the time I was listening to like The Doors and Van Morrison and stuff like this, and I just remember hearing about this legendary new music that was coming over from Britain, and the Smiley t-shirt was beginning to appear and white gloves and stuff like that. But it took a long time after that before it actually broke through.
I was actually in London. We were squatting and there was a lot of Irish over there. You would see things like acid, do you know what's going on? Or, there was all these little hints. And even in the indie clubs, you'd see people with smiley faces and stuff like that.
The very essence of a good dance club is a place that not only allows you to listen to good music, but at its very essence, it's a peer environment to allow you to actually meet interesting people. The Hirschfeld Centre and the services that it offered, like Flickers, were extraordinarily important. So much of that was just knocked offside. The Hirschfeld Centre was burnt out. Hirschfeld Centre never recovered. It later became offices for GCN. I mean, it wrought awful devastation. DJs had their records burned, the fabric of the building, the interior fabric was destroyed. And again, it's sort of illustrative of the endemic homophobia that even existed, that was state sanctioned, existed at state level. The National Lottery turned down a measly grant of 200,000 punts to rebuild what was not only Ireland's most significant, most important lesbian gay community resource, but was one of the world's oldest LGBT centres.
The movement that might have started in Flickers eventually evolved into, a whole creation of a place like Sides. In the early 80s were probably more like the late 70s still. And there was that sort of slightly oppressive, slightly closed, slightly narrow sense if you were in Dublin. So that definitely had changed hugely by 87.
The dust jackets actually melted down on top of the decks. And afterwards, when I was handling the insurance negotiations, the loss adjuster said, I'll give you the whole value of the decks. And I just went off to an audio engineer friend of mine and said, Tony, do whatever you can. Here's some money, fix them. And of course, there's still smoke damage and staining from the fire, and there's a little bit of, you can see the buttons are melted a little bit, and apart from the tone arm being replaced, they work perfectly.
The first time I went to Sides, I went with my sister. My sister brought me. I didn't know what the club was at the time. It was like a gay club as such, but it was mixed. All types of people basically in the club, And it was around 1986, and I went in. You're playing alternative music, and it was like the first time I heard house music. Right, there was a guy called Liam Fitzpatrick who was DJing, and he was playing some music that I never heard before, And basically, you went up and asked him what it was, and he said it was house music, So it was the first time that I actually heard like a house sound was inside there,
To hear house music coming through big speakers, now it was absolutely amazing, and it was just like, it's very hard to explain because everyone is so used to it now, but to hear those first few house tracks, and the production was getting better. I remember buying a record, I think it was Bizarre Inc., playing with knives and just playing it before I went on, and I just couldn't get over how sound system was behaving that night, and that was part of it. It was just new.
Sides took a script that had been finally developed over several years by Flickers and ramped it up. I mean, it had a really interesting roster of DJs, people like Paul Webb and Liam Fitzpatrick, who essentially anchored the place, to be joined later on by a new generation of up-and-coming DJs like Mick Walsh and Pat Hyland, Billy Scurry, Liam Dollard, Johnny Moy.
About 10 of us or 20 of us were going there, and we're meeting up on a Saturday in the Abbey Mall. You know, we weren't even DJs then. There was Liam Dollard, who was probably the first of us to get up and actually play. It was more like Liam Fitz, Martin McCann and Tony Walsh that were sort of at the helm. And then bit by bit Liam started to get a half an hour at the end, and he started to introduce more like Chicago house, like sort of real house music on top of what the lads were doing with disco. And that basically was the seeds that set the tone for Dublin.
I came back from London, it was 1990, and it was, the dance music scene was really kicking off in England. It was really, it was nearly mature at that stage. It was 2 years into it. They had their raves, the clubs were doing really well, and so I actually worked in the cloakroom and sides for about 2 or 3 months when I came back. Because we knew friends, and at that time it was Liam Fitz. It was more or less still gay, you know. There was a mix coming into it. That was in 1990. And then one night I was asked to play at a sort of warehouse party, and it's just down the end of Thomas Street. There was an old building, and luckily enough for me, a lot of people that were going to sides came up to it. And for that one night, it was a Friday night, I think, and sides was more or less empty. And the owners sort of looked into why it was empty, and they realised that, well, they realised that cloakroom guy had sort of was playing at a warehouse party, and that he had robbed all their punters. So they sacked me, but they offered me a job as one of their DJs on a Friday night in sides, and that's how I started there. You know, that was 1990 at some stage.
You came in basically down the stairs. You came in, there was like a doorway here, and there was some steps that you came down. Well, originally the bar was along the wall here, but when I was in the club, they moved the bar from here and they brought it basically back. It was right in where the storeroom was, and this wall wasn't here. This is like partition, and the place basically continued on down to where the toilets are, and you had music going on in here as well. And as I said, the main room was upstairs.
There would be a gang that would come down from Belfast. They would add an extra 60, 70 people in, and like they were just special nights, you know. It was funny because that's in my mind, that's when it started, because when they were coming down and mingling with the Dublin crowd, it was all fairly, it was all good music. There was no yokes in the place, you know what I mean? They weren't there. It was more sort of a trippy vibe, you know, like, you know, it was that sort of thing going on. So, and that went on for a few months, a few visits. They'd come down and everyone dancing away. It was all that, as I said, that little sort of that type of thing going on. And then all of a sudden there was a complete change. It was a different vibe going on, and basically they were yoked up, basically, you know what I mean? And that was the start of it for me. And then that's how the Dublin crowd got into it, and that's when it all changed for me.
It's possibly the first place where you could have some hardcore head the ball from Crumlin, and I'm not saying everyone from Crumlin is a hardcore head the ball, but you've some hardcore head the ball from Crumlin dancing up against some outrageous queen. And they're both sharing a bottle of poppers or something, you know? And telling each other how much they enjoy the music, or giving each other a back rub or something while they're inhaling Vicks. It was really quite extraordinary for that. I mean, I actually think the club had a very important part to play in breaking down a load of those barriers.
Where I'm standing right now, this was the main dance floor right here, and just over here The DJ box was, there was a flight of stairs, went up, and you went up into the DJ box. But all this, basically, this was the dance floor. The sound system was brilliant. It was like, I think up here there was about a 10K rig up here. Like, and it used to thump, you know, 700-800 people in the place. You couldn't move. It was like a sweat box. Like the condensation used to be dropping off the ceiling, basically, you know. So when I was DJing, I used to basically have to wear shorts, like with the heat in the place, you know. This is it. This is the place, you know. The holy grail of dance music in Ireland, you know. This is it. This is it. Sides.
.2302 is our number here at DLR. That's 2852302. Your votes count, and ultimately your votes shall pick the DJ mixing champion from Dublin.
I think DLR was Dunleary right down. I think it was local radio. I'm not too sure who was involved in it. 91, there was no dance music on the radio, you know. It was, you know, you couldn't listen to it. Unless you went into the Abbey Disc and bought vinyl, you couldn't listen to dance music. Like, we'd sit in friends' bedrooms, listen to the vinyl and stuff, like, you know, and kind of stumbled across this show. And talked to people at raves. Have you heard, you know, DJ bass playing on Friday night in the sweatbox?
I think they went on from about 5 or 6 till about 10 or 11 o'clock. He was connected with the DFC organisation and various things like that. Had a zine and other stuff, but so you'd hear every sort of music. Like, you'd hear someone play piano house for an hour, then someone would mix techno for an hour, then someone else would do hip hop.
But it was all tapes, really, like a lot of tape sharing. You know, somebody would get a tape of a load of records, not even mixed or anything, you know what I mean? Just a load of records, like, just recorded, like. God knows where they got it, but you do that and you record that and you pass it on and all this kind of thing, you know.
Last summer of '91 was actually Dublin's, in my opinion, first. Actually, the Summer of Love. The place was absolutely jumping. It was a good summer. The music changed. Obviously, personally, I was DJing, so I seen it firsthand, and it was like, it was brilliant. It was a special place.
Looking back on these photographs now, like the ones from the Mansion House and that, I mean, I know a couple of the lads there, but I guess maybe because you knew them from around the area at the time or whatever, they just look incredibly young, like 16. And I always have to think, because some of the lads that I knew were younger than me, that we were all in around the same age. I kind of tend to forget that I was probably only 22 or 23 myself, probably.
The raves in the Mansion House was where it all started off. But I'd never really into that sort of, you know, old man scene, like, you know, to go from a pub or a club. It was bizarre, you know, going into this dark room with heavy noise and sweat dripping off the ceilings and stuff, like, you know. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. There was nothing sort of you could compare it with, like, you know. It was for me, it was life-changing.
Probably around the time the first ones were kicking off, we were still kind of straddling that indie dance spectrum, and we were queuing up outside for one of these nights in McGonagall's, and could just see down on Dawson Street kind of the queues forming for the Mansion House up the road, and it's that kind of time you're thinking to yourself, am I in the right queue?
Once somebody said, right, there's a Mansion House, such and was playing, the word went out, you know, you'd meet people and everyone's going, yeah, I heard, yeah. So, you know, there was a kind of like a wave of knowledge that would go through the city anytime something happened. And it really was like that. It felt really special, and it felt, you know, there was like an insider knowledge.
I remember going into town on a Saturday morning, you'd see people in their puffy jackets and their red fila boots, and you just kind of catch each other's eye, and you'd have this knowing smile that you're all knew this big secret, and you just know you were about going raving that night.
I remember the first gig I did in there, I had 600 kids in there, mainly north inner city, and they all came with little rucksacks on, and here's me going, what the hell is going on here? They all had complete changes of clothes in the rucksacks, so they'd go into the room, they'd do what they do, they'd dance non-stop for 3.5 hours, then they'd go, get the rucksack out, change from the wet, sweaty clothes into dry clothes, and away they go again. And I'm standing at the door beside an off-duty guard who was working there on the night, and there was 600 kids whooping and hollering and singing and dancing, going out the door. And I turned to the guard and I says to him, what do you reckon? He says, I prefer this than if there were 600 kids drunk, he said, because if there were 600 kids drunk, they'd all be boxing their heads off themselves now. Look at them now. They're all singing and dancing and laughing.
there was a real massive cultural mix there, you know what I mean? Not cultural in terms of races, because there was still no multicultural like race action going on in Dublin then. Like. But in terms of class, you know what I mean? There was people from all different classes there, like, and it didn't matter, like, you know what I mean? It's just like, it was, I'm only saying that incidentally, like, it was just, it was kind of a sense of freedom, you know what I mean?
You come in here, like, because there was like 2 months between raves or whatever, and in that time you'd build up some new tunes. Like, I mean, you'd be constantly waiting for new stuff to come out, and it was literally like getting fresh bread. You know, I got a fresh one here, and you were just dying to get an audience then to you know, to play to, because music, it was developing so quickly. Like big pianos, big riffs, like big breakbeats, big bass lines, and it was more. The music was even tailored for these type of venues, like warehouse music. You know.
Tony Gregory inside the Mansion House, followed by RTE cameras. All these guys with their tops off, pouring sweat, saying how great it was, how much they loved him. I think he seemed pretty shocked by the whole thing.
Scion train. So that night, Tasty in the Rock Garden, like, it's so. All the information is on that, but it's so hard to figure out what's actually on. So I suppose that's the difference. In those early days, I think people brought a little element of creativity to it. It was perhaps because it was hand-drawn, perhaps because maybe design software pushes you down a particular route or kind of limits what you can do.
That picture was from a rave that Francois, who used to do the UFO club in the Rock Garden and on the waterfront, held out in UCD. And it was that kind of thing in that first kind of year in 1991 where it was happening in little areas you wouldn't expect, as well as little clubs that were popping up.
The college authorities, they kind of knew what was going on. I mean, it was obvious if you'd walked into the bar on a Friday night that it was a full-on rave going on. I mean, at the time, especially around October and all that sort of stuff, you have people coming in literally with bags full of magic mushrooms, just handing them out for free. So I got quite sloppy in the bar at that, you can well imagine. And then you'd have the big raves then in the restaurant. I mean, we put one on. It was Paul Davis was lens officer at the time, and he put on the Urban Cookie Collective. And crap, I've got the key, I've got the secret. They were just so bad. Louis, who was the sound and production manager in the restaurant, he just went up and just fucked them off the stage. That was it. That was the end of it. Back on with the DJs then. I mean, that's what people wanted. They didn't want to hear that sort of kind of nonsense.
The Mansion House ones weren't on all that often, but the Olympic ones were on pretty much every week, so you could go raving every week there.
Been searching high and low around Dublin, looking for a venue, and eventually came across this. It was actually being run by an ex-Garda called John, and at the time he was doing kind of a cure night, and there was literally about 6-7 people in it. Like, so I told him I'd have this place full, like, in a couple of weeks' time, and lo and behold, we did. Like, and we had some coaches coming from Belfast and Cork and Waterford. The place was packed, absolutely packed. Like.
The Olympic, everyone that went there knew it was a kip, but it was like our own special kip. Like, everybody loved it. It was the week that Alternate were playing in the Mansion House. I remember Mark Kavanagh, and he held up an Alternate record. He broke the record and shouted, "Fuck Alternate, fuck the Mansion House," and everyone that was there, like, loved Alternate and loved the Mansion House, but everyone knew what he meant. Like, it was almost like announcing, like, this is our place, this is our home, and just the place went crazy. So yeah, everyone got it.
So that was another great thing about, like, the rave scene. It was quite desexualized, is that when you were raving with girls, as a general rule, you weren't really flirting with them or anything like that. It was the last thing in your mind. You were like an army of the future, raving towards the horizon of consciousness. You weren't like a man or a woman or anything like that. You were just like buzzing.
It was a complete culture shift. It was so inclusive, and people likened it to the football terraces in the 80s. But even that was based on a division. But this was tribal, and anyone could join in, and you wanted anyone to join in. You wanted to tell people you worked with and people you went to college with, or even members of your family. You wanted everyone to come and experience what it was like, because it was just so amazing. It was like nothing that had ever happened before.
For me, I suppose the first regular
club going place where I felt was a regular club was a Temple of Sound. I think it was around 93, 94, late 93 when it opened. And that would have been the place where me and a lot of mates would have gone on a regular basis. And on a Friday, Johnny Moy and Billy Scoy did a night called Valhalla, and they did that pretty religiously every week. And it was a real nice build-up through the night. Johnny would play some kind of chilled out. You'd have stuff like Portishead, or there might be some old Schooly D, or there'd be Matar, or some of the skankier Sabres of Paradise stuff. And then it would slowly progress. And you know, by the end of the night, you'd have Billy Scurry rocking out some Roy Davis Jr. acid jams, or some of the Relief stuff that was out, or some Red Planets. So it was a nice introduction to the kind of, I suppose, a slightly teleological structure of DJing, but at the time it really worked well. You had a real choice selection of music.
Lots of Temple of Sound, that's it. Temple of Sound produced. They kept some printing company in business for about 3.5 years. When we were in our raving prime, that was probably the place where we went. That was stuffed to the gills every weekend. You had kind of boxes on the side, and to my shame, I danced on those boxes a few times. Sometimes even bare-chested. And from there it went down dance floor, and in the far left-hand corner, in the most awkward place, is where the toilet was. And that was the Temple of Sound. I can remember it quite distinctly, actually.
So it wasn't all focused towards the DJ in one direction. You know, you got down the bottom of the club and you probably couldn't even make out the DJ for all the smoke machines. I'm not saying it was like Shoom or this kind of like religious experience, but it was different maybe from how club spaces seem to be set up these days.
Have you seen my Pope John Paul II rug? I love the fact that every time I come into my studio, it gives me an opportunity to actually wipe my dirty shoes on his face. But it's actually a vintage little piece of cultural history, Ireland 1979, you know? How many guys do you know who are called JP? We were talking about Elevator. I wanted to show you some flyers from Elevator. By the time Elevator started in Halloween 93, so only a few months after Horny Organ Tribe had really sort of built up a head of steam, we were working with Niall Sweeney, an old mate of mine and one of Ireland's most celebrated graphic designers. We went from these fairly rudimentary two-colour flyers that are just so screened. I mean, very, 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 very basic stuff. Although this is one of my favorites. It's quite cute. Just simply, it's very Japanese style, the HOT with a wee little lizard, which became our sort of monogram. Again, very, very simple. This is from 1994. But and then the best of all, of course, are the Horny Organ cards, the donor cards, which were essentially our membership cards. I wish to give my hips, my groove, my horns, my organs, my thing, undressed to impress. And people could use these for a discount into Elevator as well.
Tony and Derek were the main guys in the Horny Organ Tribe, and they always were attracted to people that had something to bring. There was someone face painting, there was piercers, masseuses, obviously DJs. You'd be like walking around with your mouth open, just checking everything out. There was something going on in every single part of the venue.
The Orm Multimedia was down in Ormond Quay. That's probably the first club I went to, actually the first time I took a pill or anything. It's like I was doing my leaving cert, and we had a leaving cert party. And yeah, 2 floors, or maybe it was 2 rooms. And I think I spent most of my time in the ambient room. It was like amazing. Blew my head off completely. I didn't really go into the banging. I didn't get into the banging stuff till a bit later.
It was good because you'd always get the gays going, you'd get the crusties going. I saw the guys from Keela used to go. You'd get like the techno hippies that might have been into indie music, but they were open-minded to dance music, might have wanted to go and take ease or whatever.
There was that very strong sort of mid-90s scene, countercultural scene, typified by the crusties and squatters and people, and the free party circuit. And there was a whole network of people that myself and my mates in Horny Organ Tribe imagined ourselves a part of, and also enjoyed actually being a part.
A classic coda of the time would have been, what's your name, where are you from, how many are you on? And everyone said it, and it wasn't tongue-in-cheek. It was actually literally what everyone used to say to each other. And generally it would end with a hug.
The atmosphere in the place was incredible. It smelled like a sauna with all the Vicks going on and people going around with their tops off. And again, back to that whole vibe and this feeling that you were on the edge of a scene that was just so fresh and new. Really healthy music going through the place, lots of different DJs, and this was all supported by the network of pirate radio stations that were on all around the country, not just in Dublin, you know.
So this was a naive, exciting, beautiful place where there was just a complete mix of people, which is really important. You know what I mean? Is that people just didn't know how to look cool, and that was beautiful. You know what I mean? It was like a slice of society had just stepped indoors and started raving.
I had the money for the decks. I've been saving for ages. Tony Walsh and people like that were letting me practice on the decks. And then a second-hand pair on hire purchase in Sounds Around, but they were taken back because they were destroyed or they hadn't been paying them. So I'd heard a rumour that there was a pair of second-hand Technic 12s in Sounds Around. And yeah, I had the money. I was waiting for that opportunity. And ran down and bought them there and then. So that was really, and this is still the same pair, and they have never given me any trouble at all.
The little rap groups I used to DJ for in the late 80s, after a while the 4-track isn't enough, or you want a proper demo. So we went scouting around, and through a friend of a friend, we ended up in Radioactive, which is Mr. Spring's studio out in Bray, from SoundCloud. They were already doing their own thing, but we brought in a little element of hip-hop, which I think they appreciated from a production angle, because we've been using like samples all the time, and even some of the early house stuff, the Todd Terry stuff, is just crammed full of samples, all funk samples and this and that. So everything just kind of clicked together for those couple of years.
That's Tim's little sampler. I think it's an S28, an Akai S28. Here he's got an S1040 and an Akai reel-to-reel. It's 8-track. That's how we recorded, and he played the samples through this. And the MCs would be through there, but this is where Tim would usually sit as the engineer. But he was so enthusiastic that when he was trying to get you to do your best performance, he'd go 1, 2, 3 and mega!
The whole connection of Abbey Mal and Abbey Discs and all the people that we met, that all started with a scene of hip-hop and just a gang of people going, you know, we did that and no one else did. We were all alone. It was really sad. But, you know.
Yeah, innovators.
Yeah, fuck it. And pioneers of many stories of that, and like Ray Darcy, he was one of them. Yeah. Tony Christie.
Actually, the Zig and Zag, the Christmas #1 was made out in your house.
Yeah, in my parents' garage.
We were always aware, the early 90s, that there was no real homemade stuff. I messed around with a tune called Moon Boom, which there was a band called the Mad Sound Disease, and they put on some great shows, and they should have done a lot better. And there was Liquid Wheel, etc. And there was some, but there was nothing really turning up on vinyl. There was Bumble, which is Matt Early. He brought out a tune which Andy Weatherall was playing at the time.
There was a bodhrán, a whistle, a flute and a reel. And then from there we put a Kashmir Underground Goodies sample in there. The bass line was an idea that I had for putting 2 left field bass lines back to back, backwards, and connecting them together, and basically a couple of samples from some of the records out of the box. And we had this track called The Bumble. It was fairly unknown in Ireland. People didn't really latch onto it or support it as such, you know. I recall being down in Sir Henry's in Cork and hearing Justin Robinson playing on St. Patrick's Night in '92. And it was amazing, you know, the atmosphere in the place. And the place went berserk. It went wild to this diddly idle Irish track with house beats being played by one of the coolest DJs on the planet. And it was a special moment for me because I co-produced the record and I felt really excited about it. Plenty of people out there with these white labels because there was a couple of thousand of these pressed. Originally, I believe it was bootlegged in the UK. I don't know how true that is, but someone told me there was like 10,000 bootlegged in the UK before its release on London Records. It took almost a year before it surfaced as a proper release, which was unfortunate because I think had they dropped it when the time was right, it would have done even better.
Red was the first independent dance label in Ireland, and Abbey was one of the only independent vinyl sellers in Dublin. Probably around the country would have been the bigger ones. So they obviously had a working relationship with Billy and Abbey Discs. If you wanted vinyl, that was the place to go. If you wanted imports, that was the place to go. You could order them from Billy. Certainly we noticed when we were making releases, one of the benchmarks was how many you shifted through Billy on a Saturday afternoon.
It was a hub in a way, but I suppose I'd more would have floated around a lot of the other shops. So Future Groove was on Found Street, and then you would have had Music Power in Merchant's Arch. Comet was always like an interesting spot to pop into, Borderline. So for me, it would have been about having a route or a circuit and hitting up a lot of different shops over the course of the day. I know Future Groove would have had a certain community feel to it where certain DJs would have gravitated there, and similarly for Abbey Discs.
Abbey Mall was always a busy place even before this happened. The hip-hop guys were in there, but it did become the home of the culture during the day.
Every guy who was a teenager in his 20s had a record bag, you know, over his shoulder in the mid-90s, I remember. Saturday afternoon, everyone was buying vinyl.
I put on Paul Oakenfold, this thing called the Zoo Weekender, and he said he wants to go shopping, like, you know, so we went to the Abbey Discs, he wants to pick up a couple of records, and of course Billy there behind the counter twigs who it is, and goes, "Oh, grand, do you mind signing this for me?" And Oakenfold, "Yeah, sure, no problem," like, you know, Abbey Discs, whatever, like, you know. Billy just goes, "Great stuff," sticks up the wall, goes, "I get 20 quid for that." Cheeky fecker, but I mean, it was quite funny.
Billy, he knew exactly what kind of music you liked. So as soon as he saw you, he'd pull out 10 or 12 inches off the shelf of the kind of music that you like and hand them to you, you know. So it was kind of personalised in that way.
Before the magic of the internet, you'd either be given a list of records you'd have to choose from, and then the distributors started playing them down the phone, which was good. So you'd be on the phone for an hour and they'd literally have a record player and a speaker. They were holding the handset up to it.
And you'd be listening and you go, "Yeah, I'll take 4 of them, yeah, I'll take 5 of them, yeah, 2 of them, 8 of them," you know what I mean? That's how you order your records.
The boxes would arrive and you'd have people swarming around the counter, and I'd turn my back just to pick up the phone, and suddenly the boxes would be ripped open. You know, people were just so enthusiastic about the arrivals, the deliveries. Yeah, there was kind of a sense of excitement any time a box of records arrived in any of the record shops, you know. And I guess you don't get that now.
The clubs started to I mean, you could go to certain clubs and have a good time, but some of the clubs you'd want to go to, there was other heads in them and gangs and that, and there was a bad vibe and that. Like, a few mates used to go to the Asylum, and I was like, I'm not going to the Asylum. Like, I didn't like the techno, the heavy techno music, and there was a lot of vibes there as well.
I know there was a lot of bad publicity and stuff around it, and you know, it was a bit of aggro, and you know, there were people doing bad stuff. But at the same time, it was pretty unrivaled for the intensity of the atmosphere in the place. And I think there was also a bit of kind of, you know, snobbery against the whole thing as well, you know, just because it was so in your face. And, you know, dance music doesn't belong to middle classes or to gay people or to black people. It belongs to absolutely everybody.
Up where the Academy sign is now at the moment used to be the logo of the club with the star with the key going through it, yeah. It's been taken down. Someone obviously got their hands on it, you know. So that's what the logo was. If you're walking past O'Connell Street on a Saturday night, you'd look down and you'd see the big star and the key, you know. The Asylum, the place to be. Yeah. This club here is like a one-off. There'll never be another club. There'll never be another club like this club. Like, I mean, you know, when the guards shut the club down and the boys went to court, they had the club, and the judge put an order on the club. You know, he called it a den of iniquity, and this building here will never ever be a club ever again. for what went down in the club, you know, for the madness. But it was good madness, you know.
So it had its honeymoon period. It was some three great years. It wasn't all happy days there. There was some trouble there, you know. There was trouble with the door. There was trouble with some of the punters. There was some hairy stuff going on in there that you wish you hadn't seen, you know, like so. But it did happen. There's no point going into it, and it did end. Our little chapter ended a bit sourly, you know. So
we all had incredible experiences, and then we all saw very dark.
Yeah, it just got really rough. If there's
it became more, I don't know, sinister.
Yeah.
You know, and
if you get a lot of money floating around or an opportunity to make a lot of money, things are going to go wrong somewhere. You know? It's like, and that's why we moved on, because as soon as, like, again, we were sort of thinking with the acid house philosophy, and like everyone was, it's like going back to the experience of sides. No one cared who you were, what you did. They just loved dancing for 12 hours to awesome music.
There was extraordinary amounts of burnout. There were dead bodies. Literally dead bodies being found, people dying of either heat exposure, dehydration, because of course nobody knew any better in some cases. They would turn the taps off. For a long time, right through the mid-90s, many venues where they knew there was a tacit acknowledgement of their ecstasy-fueled clientele, they would turn the taps off. They wanted people to buy a drink or pay for the water. And there was always, it was raided with impunity by increasing regularity by the cops. And when that happens, you realize, okay, this place is on a hiding to nowhere. It's time to go.
there we go. I knew it was here somewhere. So this is Romeo and Juliet. This was the last song that I used to play. Obviously it wasn't the last song every time, every gig I did, but some of the more memorable nights that I can think of in Sides on a Friday night back in '91, I used to end with this. Hopefully it's at the right speed. It's one of those, I'm not saying everyone loved it, I liked it, and a lot of people did like it, and it was a bit teary. You wouldn't want to be playing it all the time, you couldn't play it all the time, but it was one of those, I thought, like, one of the more, like, what would you say, dependable last tunes, where you could play a last tune and people would be, you know, mightn't hang around. But at least with this tune, it was a favourite of the crowd back then, so, you know, people would hang around, and, like, it was actually fairly an emotional tune, you know, even listening back to it. I don't play it all the time. I don't think I've played it in over 10 years, you know what I mean? That's sort of like, I'm saying the respect I have for it, but I don't think the timing is right.
Headphones in there. We got some radio without headphones, man. Jesus. Have to use Staxis. He doesn't have the purple or the velvet earmuffs. It's like when you're going out raving on the weekend, you know what I mean? You have this release and it's like something to look forward to. It breaks up the week, like, and it's the same with doing a radio show, and it's why I still do it now. Like, every week it's just like something, it's just to get a buzz going, like, you know what I mean? You rock up with your mate and you have a bag of records, like, and buy new records for it, and you get to hear the new records, mix the new records for the first time and stuff.
For a long time, like, mainstream radio was like really resistant to dance music and electronic stuff, and really turned up their nose at it. So when other stations like did play it, was a real kind of treat. I remember it was a long time before like mainstream shows like played any kind of electronic music. They're like quite snooty towards it.
I think the very first one was Sunset FM. And then there'd be a bunch of ones that would come in and out. I think there was a bunch of different stations that called themselves Kiss FM. but the one that was the most influential by a mile was Power FM. You know, this is pre-internet, so your music sources were tapes really, and recorded tapes. So I used to sometimes tape the radio and go through the radio stations by hand, hoping to catch like a mad station from Germany, or if the weather was good enough, Radio 1 at the right time on a Saturday night. It was funny, I was so obsessed about listening to pirate radio that it was almost like I was there. I would know what was going on because I listened to it so much and just taped it. But Power FM was the big one, yeah, massive.
I always remember scanning around and just finding towards the upper end of the dial all the trancey techno-y ones, and then finding Power FM. And as soon as I found Power FM, that's what I knew. That's what I wanted, you know.
Droid, Alan Carberry, Andy Macken, Warren Kay, NAFTA, Diction, myself, Scurry, Aidan Kelly, Brian Chamberlain, who was the station, still is actually. That's a real good snapshot of everybody that was everybody in Dublin at the time. Power was brilliant, is brilliant. It really represents the city, it's a real hub.
Power was based out in kind of close to Ballyfermot. Brian Chamberlain had an apartment out there. In the sitting room of the apartment, it was a duplex apartment, and in his sitting room, underneath the stairs which went to the apartment above, is where he had the decks. And you had one deck down here, the other deck up here, and then your mixer and CD player and microphone and stuff in the middle. But when Brian would come home, he'd close the door. So you were under the stairs, kind of, that's how you were mixing it up and stuff back then.
We all had our slots. I'd have a slot on every Friday evening, and I'd go out and do it for maybe 3 or 4 years in a row, and played your house music for 3 years to people driving around in cars, and it was a pleasure to do it, you know. It was part of the culture, and it was the ads, and it was good to play in radio, you know, different, completely different.
I got involved in it because I was working in Neil Brownlee's shop, selling records, and we used to do a chart for Power. Neil used to pick out like the top 10 sellers or whatever, or 20, top 20, and he used to give it to Brian Chamberlain every week to do a show, like, you know, I think we gave him a couple of records for it as well, like, but he'd play the tunes or whatever. It was a bit of sponsorship, I suppose. And Brian was coming into the shop, and I just said to him, like, can I do a jungle show with my mate here? And I couldn't mix at all, like, at the time, right, like that. And he said, yeah. So just started, yeah. Me and NAFTA started then. About 1994, I think it was. And that was it. Been on it since then.
It's the top of the hour, it's 9 p.m. It's time for Don Roscoe, who's here in the house, in the flesh. So I'll give it over to the Don. That was the B Connection show. We'll see you here same time, same place next week. That's Wednesday here on powerfm.org. Bye for now.
I used to have, and I still regularly kick myself for having lost them. A few shoeboxes of, you know, tapes of old Rohan and after shows, and that I'd taped off there.
Power FM, New Year, 97, 98. Power 98.7 F bleeding M. But yeah, I think that's Ross and myself and the AAA. It was always a bit on and off. Was he how to get into the house? What was off? Someone wasn't playing before. It was just a complete mess. And then it moved into town, and that was when the station really took off. And it was definitely when all the DJs started coming on board then. And the roster was kind of really huge. Probably had 50, 55, 60 DJs playing every week on the station.
It was FM at the time though, so it was illegal. We were like piggybacking someone else's signal and stuff like that. And we actually, I remember like on 2 separate occasions, actually whilst playing, noticing, we were on the top floor of a building, noticing on the opposite building some men in black looking dudes with radars and headphones, literally going like this. And us literally like hitting the floor and turning off the radio station. Proper Power FM stuff, really good fun.
You're tuned to powerfm.org. Listen to Don Roscoe for, I said 12 midnight, but I'm probably not going to stay till 12 midnight because I'm on my own and I don't have 3 hours worth of records, so we'll see how we get on. Give us a shout in the shout box on the website, powerfm.org. Let us know where you're listening and all that kind of jazz.
It was a very classic pirate FM kind of buzz. There was a couch, so people would sit on the couch and blem up, and then you'd have basically somebody in the corner. It was like you were in someone's flat, someone in the corner playing records, and now and then talking on the mic. And now and then we'd get a phone call.
It had that social aspect to it, that you had that sense that a lot of people were listening to the show at the one time. When you catch up with your mates over the weekend, you're like, oh, did you hear such and such a show? Or what was that track with that sample? Have you heard it? Somebody might say, yeah, they have it in Abbey Discs, or I seen it down Future Groove.
The amount of people that used to listen and the feedback I'd get all week long, the letters I'd get from people and the phone call, like the phone was hopping all the time. I'd never today, like, you just wouldn't get that on a radio programme at all, just from the radio experience I have now.
Around 98, 1999, so it went off air when there was a bit of a crackdown on pirate radio around that time. Brian Chamberlain, who ran the station, he'd been very much ahead of his time and had already had a kind of internet platform for the station too. So even when it went off the FM band, it kind of came and went until about 2003, and then it shut down. It ceased to broadcast in FM.
It was amazing. It was a load of people working for no money and putting out the freshest music. And of course, we didn't impinge on what regular stations were doing. We were like yards ahead of the pulse with regular stations. Like what would have been cutting edge on the regular stations would have been like Dave Fanning. And he wasn't very cutting edge or anything like that.
Going out to the hardcore crew. I always think of Droid when I see subplates. For some reason, I don't know why. Anyway, pick up the Droid, all the original hardcore, massive. Powerfm.org. Thanks for listening. Back next week with stacks from 9 to 12, as usual. So yeah, see you next week. Thanks for listening.
Clubbing was the main social activity for a certain cohort in society, sort of 19 to 35 age group who had the big disposable, allegedly had the big disposable income and the greatest discretionary income, were the ones that the clothing manufacturers and the drink companies all wanted to get it. I mean, you only have to look at where is it that the flyer for an elevator here has a load of clothes shops. There's only one drinks company on this, and that's Smirnoff. McCullough's, which was the major jeans shop in town at the time. Japan, well, D1 Records, that's self-evident. Minima, which was high-end interiors, a fashion style shop. And John Russia. They didn't care, they didn't care really if the capacity crowd was also imbibing in recreational drugs as well. I don't think that really entered their minds at all.
The drugs gangs could see that they could make a fortune out of it, and they start to muscle in with the doormen. They say, okay, we're into this, we're in this club here, and there were some pretty heavy characters. Our club got raided, and we had problems with a specific family, a criminal family on the north inner city, Dublin, and they came in and they more or less put guns up to the bouncers' heads and said, we're going to sell drugs in here. So we had to shut down the place for a couple of weeks because it got completely out of hand. We had problems then nearly getting the licensing renewed. And we also made a kind of specific idea to change the music policy. Prior to that, it was kind of, trancey, banging in your face sort of music. We decided to go, okay, we'll go for more kind of Detroit-y end of stuff.
The UFO is crusties, students, inner city heads, like pretty serious heads who you'd be a bit scared of, and then they would pass you Vicks and give you a massage. So it's a very friendly but also very hard techno kind of atmosphere, but anything went, anybody was welcome. There was no trouble in my memory of anything there before they kind of clamped down quite powerfully after Dance Nation in '95.
There was a gig that we, because of Red Records and SoundCloud and Liquid Wheel and Pressure, you played at Dance Nation, didn't you? Yeah. Basically, the industry copped on. A few things happened really quickly. SoundCloud had a hit, And then it was decided, let's try and run something on the Point Depot. Everybody was Irish, and it was completely sold out, and everybody's head just turned around and went, what the fuck was that?
I mean, it was the first time that dance music was brought in by a mainstream promoter into one of the main venues of the country. There was a certain satisfaction in that when it reached that level, that it was accepted. All the DIY work, all the pirate radio stations, everybody just doing their little thing kind of build into one big crescendo to a gig of that nature, you know.
This didn't fit the normal mould of like you get the crumbling rock star, you do the promotion, you put him in a suit and you stick him on stage and everyone pays 50 quid. This was different. They couldn't put their finger on why are they here again?
I remember the guys at the PA company who were used to dealing with rock bands coming in, you know, Megadeth on tour. All right, what is this? I remember talking to the sound guys and all, and I was just saying to them, look, you don't need to do a sound check, right? It's cool.
I think it was definitely a junction in electronic music in terms of, it was a huge event, but in terms of the perception of dance culture in Ireland, there was a huge cry out. I'm not trying to be negative about the dance scene at the time, but that was a reality. The media really became very aware of what was happening from then on, and that's why I think there was raids.
So the cops were getting clever, the authorities in relation to the health and safety were getting clever and stuff, and so everything had to be rationalised, and that's when the club started, when the official club started, because the raving kind of had to stop, but people still wanted to party. So you got a very different structure then, and with the different structure you get management, sale of alcohol, which means you have to stamp out drugs, and you get door staff, which also means deportment has to change.
When the Red Box and the Pod came along, they're just completely different to the original raves and clubs. You queue up for half an hour and then you wouldn't get in. And when you get in, like, it was a great sound system and all this stuff, but it was so sanitized, and like the original raves, like there was a good mix of people, but it was like really strongly driven by the working class, I think, and it kind of got a bit posher than that.
I think back to it now, it was quite an issue getting into places in Dublin back in the early 90s, when you were, certainly when you were younger. So the Pod, when it opened up, it had at the bottom of its flyers with Dennis at the door. So Dennis in himself was a kind of personality that was now associated with the Pod. He'd been a bouncer on other clubs for years before, but all of a sudden now it was Dennis at the door. You know you're home, you're coming into the Pod, guys.
First night of the Pod when it opened, Soundcrowd were meant to play, which was me and Mark, and we were going to DJ and stuff. And it was the first night of this new club, and it had been hyped, and it was all the papers, and we turned up. And we'd handed out tickets and invitations to everybody in the Olympic the week before and the week before that, and we'd hyped it up on the radio, and we had a vibe going and mentioned it here and there, right? Question they asked everybody on the door of the Pod on the first night was, so, oh yeah, you're here for the dance, are you? Yeah, great. So you're a raver, are you? Yeah, we don't like ravers. And they just refuse you. And they sent everyone packing. And when we got on stage, the place was half full, but people in suits.
Kind of post-92, where the whole superstar DJ kind of emerged, and you had the cult of the DJ went beyond the stars. It was like fucking, you know, the DJs were huge, was the thing, and I think the clubs reflected that. They became pretty more commercial and that.
In a way, that was really kind of the last gasp, I thought, of the whole rave scene as such. I mean, once it started becoming, you know, you had your back rooms and you had your VIP areas and stuff like that. I got, that's what rave's not about, that really. You know, the whole club scene was supposed to be kind of inclusive, which I thought was the appeal for a lot of people, was that whole inclusivity. But as I said, by the mid-90s, that had really gone.
The place was full of super clubs with the chrome lights and the fancy drinks and the neon and, yeah, chrome. It was just, that's what it always reminded me of. I do remember people buying champagne, and it's I suppose, got very vulgar.
The drinks companies had no compunction about actually chasing that cohort to talk about with the large discretionary income. If you wanted clear evidence of that, you see Smirnoff taking on board what was the Smirnoff Dance Clubs Awards, which they ran for 2 or 3 years around in the late 90s. Uni Fitzsimons, God bless her, was the wonderful presenter of those awards, and it was essentially an industry knees up sponsored by Smirnoff.
Basically, there's people who were involved in the rock scene, in the promotional rock scene, I think had their ear to the ground to a degree, as in, I mean, like barons of the rock scene, the large Irish promoters. and they saw what was happening, that suddenly a lot of people weren't going to rock gigs, they were going to this new dance music thing.
Yeah, kind of that's it. When you have a groove stage, you know, dance music's made it really. It's actually a mad one. It's a fucking stupid place. You had to walk for miles to get to it. Fail in 94. Note. No groove stage. Fourth Dimension we're playing though. And SoundCloud Orchestra. Brilliant.
It's kind of difficult as well because a lot of the clubs, the actual venues themselves, they were afraid of putting on, obviously, dance events because there was a certain reputation that went with them. Or if they're going to do it, they were just going to kind of play it very safe. Or they say, okay, we'll play it safe, we'll bring over like, you know, a fairly well-known house DJ and we'll stuff the place and charge 15 quid in and then charge, say, 3 quid for a bottle of water.
Yeah, it's kind of, whoa, that's a tasty one from the system. It went from the kind of free-spirited rave ethic to kind of eventually people being herded into this kind of concept of what constituted a club or what a club was supposed to be or what the facets of a good club were. But I just didn't like that kind of the aping just the ethic or lack of by just going down a route that they plucked out of some UK magazines on dance music and just thinking this is the way to go. That's the kind of fad I'll follow.
Yeah, there was an attempt to glamorise it in Dublin, but Dublin isn't glam. You know, nobody was going to clubs wearing bikinis and hot pants. Maybe in the Temple Theatre, there, you know, were a few podium dancers with thigh-high boots, but that was never going to work in the majority of clubs.
It was around 96, 97, 98, that kind of area, and just the fear was really rising. All those illegal raves were gone. The radio stations were being shut down. So there was a bit of a kind of a different feeling going on.
The music had become so developed at the time in the country. Everybody started to get their own little niches going. Everybody started not just to like dance music, they liked drum and bass. They began to like hard house. So in many ways that kind of dispersed the whole scene.
The sense that I got was that people felt emotionally exposed by being on ecstasy. And so they didn't like that feeling of not being in control. It fell out of favour. But the scene was still very much alive because I think once people had been exposed to electronic music, they still had that interest in it. We're not just in this for hedonism. And it was about, well, look, how do we create a legacy? How do we show that this is our culture? This is a form of our expression. And I think very much the funnel club was very much significant in that.
And basically, 4 people, from what I remember, ran in clubs there. Bassbin, The Fear, D1, and Ultramac. So it was basically the best, the most serious players in the whole of Dublin, the whole Decal and Ultramac and all their crew. Then the D1 crew, who of course, you know, were the brilliant at the techno and house. The Fear, which was me and Droid and Slug and T-Soul, Trouble Soul to start with. Basically we were like electronica and freak out stuff and hip hop. T-Soul was this amazing scratch DJ. He doesn't live here anymore, but he was the best.
So this is a Decal EP and this was released 2000. And I played this a lot when I was DJing. Like the first album they did was so amazing and it was 94, so just a year after Autechre's first album, you know, so very much around that period when alternative electronic music was really beginning to take off. And, you know, it only came out on CD, which was a problem. But it still stands up as really an amazing piece of alternative music. Like the last track on that is about 20 minutes long. It's an amazing piece.
We always had the idea that there was no point in just bringing over DJs. We had to create our own indigenous version of it to give it a kind of to make it an actual scene. And so therefore we had to do radio, we had to have a shop to sell the stuff, we had to bring in a new generation younger DJs and give them support gigs and be encouraging. We had it not just about, hey, here's Grooverider again, he cost 15 grand and you're all going to pay 40 quid and then nothing till the next time. It couldn't survive on that. So we had a kind of longer term view of trying to make it more sustainable or something, I suppose.
All we wanted to do at the time was, play our tunes, and like Ross and Shane, they're on like Power FM forever. Like obviously bass bin, we're doing little bits, but it was just like, what chance we had of playing the music that anyone was just to ourselves in the bedroom, because there was no clubs, and the odd time we get gig at a party, people go just fuck that off. Like, I mean, there's tons of stories that we were fucked out of parties, like, just because you can't.
Red card.
Yeah, like dangerous fucking situations where I was like, I'll play a few tunes, and there's just lads going, what the fuck is that? Like, seriously. So yeah, there was no audience for it. Like, so I just think, to summarise it up, we just all conglomerated on, like, we just moved into town, and we all just kind of honed in towards each other.
I think in the UK, like there was like a big explosion of people producing their own music because they had to. That's what originally kicked things off, like at the house from Chicago and the techno coming in from Detroit. But it didn't quite fuel the rave scene until DJs started making their own music. But I think over here, there was so much music coming over from the UK that people didn't really have to make their own music to fuel the rave scene. There's just plenty of records coming in from the UK. Like it was a long time before there was kind of groups of people like D1, equivalents of Warp, I guess, like you were like a gang of people and a music label and a club night. There was like very little of that. There was mostly just, for a long time, just people who put on nights.
I think when you go back and you maybe look at some of the stuff from the mid-90s, maybe even look at some of the UMAC stuff, some of the Anodyne stuff, some of that, you could, I'm sure people from that time and listening back, you could say, there's something in that sound that sounded like Dublin. Even some of the records D1 were putting out, it was Detroit influenced, but if you go back and listen to a Donica Costello record from back then, that sounds the way Dublin sounded back then,
We just started a club because nobody else was going to give us gigs.
Yeah, it was exactly the same for Basement. It was literally DJs nowhere to play.
Yeah.
We were just buying the records thinking we have to play these somewhere. And it had kind of moved from the era of house parties or raves in disused buildings or whatever. A lot of that got clamped down on, and now there was the audience, the main audience, it was moving into the city centre and looking for clubs to go to. And for us, there was always like, if we could just get people to hear the music in the right environment.
Yeah.
Because we already could imagine, or we sometimes would make the trip abroad to go to somewhere where everyone knew what was going on.
The big thing, I think, with the Funnel and Switch and the Metropolitan as well was the MCs we had, which wasn't really done. Like, I mean, they had MCs in the Mansion House and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And they had them probably in another few sort of old hardcore things, but MCs were kind of a dirty word in Dublin for dance events,
Big time.
People hated them. They hated them. And they were vocal about their hate, And we just, we knew, to be a proper jungle club or a drum and bass club, you had to have MCs, You just had to have MCs. So we were very lucky with the MCs we got.
Clubs like Switch, they were dark, they were dingy, they were sweaty, but that's what was so exciting about them. Switch reminded me of the smaller clubs in Manchester in the early 90s, like the PSV. I mean, everybody was just joining in and jumping and hugging, and it was all about the music. It wasn't about how people looked or how they moved. It was just all about the music and about being together.
Musically, there wouldn't have been a massive amount of crossover, right? I mean, there would have been a bit, but Doyler was never mad about jungle and he never got into jungle. But it was more about sort of sharing ideas about how we could do things and how we could do things on our own, and sort of taking confidence from each other doing these kinds of things, you know what I mean?
Even to this day, if you go online or try and track down a 303, the mental money to still go for, plus, I suppose now, because everything was hardware-based really at that time, and you had to shell out to get modules and synths and stuff like that. Now there's so much freeware. We don't use any cracked software, but people out there do, and it's so much easier. You just need you know, a desktop computer and you're away, or a laptop or something, and off you go.
I remember Ross actually gave us a CD of software, like, and this is how hard it was, like, to get Cubase and Soundforge, and there's a few programs on it, and I was like, oh, this was like gold. I was like, I can't believe we finally got a copy of this program, you know?
Yeah.
We had a sampler, we had a MIDI keyboard. It was very, like, it was another really difficult thing to produce tunes, because a sampler was £2,000, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You need a mixing desk, and like, you need a couple of grand, and how could you get that money? You just couldn't get it, like, so it was really impossible.
But we did though, like, we
did,
got it
yeah.
together. I got a bank loan as well, I think, actually. I bought a mixing desk, got a £3 loan.
It was a very niche hobby for a lot of people. You know, there weren't that many people making music that I knew of. But then again, I wasn't asking questions. I didn't know everyone back in the 90s. You know, I got to know people within the scene towards the very late part of the 90s.
This is the old basement that was full of clay, and I think there was about 10,000 army jackets stored down here that my dad had bought. But when we lifted them all up and threw them in the bin, it was just clay and bone. It was really nice then. We had a record shop in there, a studio in here, and we used to get a lot. At that time, we were on the Club and Fun, so we would have had a lot of international artists over. So we'd always try and get them to stay for 4 or 5 days, get them into the studio and try and get a record out of them. So our remix, at least, you know what I mean. So we got a lot of stuff back from Broom and Maz, Ian Pearson, Envoy. DJ Bone was down here, Skull, just loads of the kind of artists that were coming over at the time. Then when we set up Def, I moved over to Moore Street with the studio, and then Basement took over this.
56 Eden Grove, Holloway, London, N7. Music House is where everybody got their dub plates cut. Like all the big jungle DJs in England or whatever. This is two NAFTA tunes, Badman and Rise. And like when you go there, like, it's like Mecca, you know what I mean? It's like you could walk in there, like, and you can get this cut for, I think it was £35 at the time for one record. This is pre-CD and pre-Serato, all that kind of thing. So if you wanted to play your own tunes in a club, you needed to get a dub plate cut. So like going there, I think we went over a couple of times, like, and you could always do it mail order as well, like, but going in there was the thing to do. Like, it just, I don't know, man. It was just something magical about the place. Like, I think it was reggae that they did there. Like, I think that was their vibe. But you know, they cut records for whoever, you know.
Well, Def came out of the funnel, really, I think, because that was the first time where we kind of identified. It was Basement doing their thing. There was Ultramac doing kind of their thing on D1, and it was around about the same time that all the big raves started to, like the commercial raves, started to happen, like Creamfields and Homelands, and me and Fiddler, I think, were involved in one of them, and then Pod were doing the other one. And basically, none of us were getting booked. Just figured it'd be a good idea to put on a festival that we could kind of showcase ourselves alongside our kind of international peers. You know, we were kind of involved with Underground Resistance and Broom and Bassbin, where you were already in touch with 4Hero and all those kind of dudes. And also, we thought it'd be a good idea to do a city festival.
I think it was, for me, it was sort of summing up of what had gone happened in the 10 years or so before that, you know.
And the club scene had really happened and had peaked, I think, and was just starting to, we didn't realise we were just at the start of the madness, I suppose, of the Celtic Tiger, so.
I suppose once the Vintners realised that club culture was sucking the life out of their bars, they moved to Lobby the Dole, and they got their extension. And so you saw a huge amount of late bars opening up and installing a DJ, and that was it. That was absolutely the death of club culture in Dublin.
We would regularly have the funnel would be full at like 10 o'clock. But as soon as the late licenses, the Vintners Association, and that could have possibly been a reaction to the whole club thing, but as soon as that kicked in, where you could buy a late license for like £200 and open up until 2:30, which is the same time as the clubs were opening up to, and they basically filled all their bars with DJs. We lost that crowd of people that weren't really coming down to see you. They were coming down because they needed a pint and they liked techno. That basically, I think that definitely killed the scene.
It was a generational thing as well. A lot of the people who had been into the kind of rave scene in Ireland or in Dublin since the
early 90s had kind of fallen off either through exhaustion or because they had to go out and get a job or they started having kids or whatever it was.
While you had this initial burst of euphoria, I think, at the start of the scene, where you had all people, all classes, all types coming together, that was gone by the late 90s. You had people going out to the Temple Theatre, listening to trance, tops off, and that was their scene. And our scene was techno in the kitchen, you know, and never the twain would meet. And in fact, the only time you would see a mix-up would have been the beach parties and the parties down in Wicklow, where all sorts would emerge.
I always loved a bit of variation. Like, you go to the Olympic Ballroom, you'd hear like 4/4 stuff, and then a bit of breaks, and back to 4/4, a bit of hard stuff, then back to mellow stuff, and the variation really broke up tonight. But like, obviously, like much years later, you go to a techno club and all you hear is bang, bang, bang for the whole night, and that's when I really started losing interest. But even at those times, like, there was kind of outdoor raves and beach parties firing up, and they kind of went back to the original spirit of things. Like, there was a crowd called Creation. They put on a lot of beach parties and down in Bait, and even in like kind of forest parties, and they put on a warehouse rave. One guy got on playing jungle and another guy playing techno, and even the same DJs like mixing it up for the whole night.
The Funnel Club, unfortunately, had probably just closed maybe a year or two before. That was one of my regular haunts. D1 were doing some banging nights in there now, and I just moved over from Hackney after doing you know squat parties and raves and whatnot over there. So when I came over here, I couldn't believe that there was nowhere that you could dance to until 6, 8, 10, 12 o'clock the next day. It's just, I was absolutely flabbergasted. We'd post something up on IE Dance, but a lot of it was word of mouth, and Simon would he'd boot out tickets for us out of the records shop.
All sorts of people came in. It wasn't the one type, and that was interesting, and maybe you got a sense of that at the parties as well. And then that whole kind of word of mouth, that you needed to pick up a ticket in a record shop or to be on their mailing list, you needed to be nominated by somebody else. So there was a little bit of adventure associated with getting out to it. There was buses being run, people were finding their own way there, and it was kind of DJ'd by local DJs. You had Giles Armstrong would play, Sunil, Fran, Rob Rowland, Rohan, Cozzy himself, Paulie. There was like a core nucleus of DJs who would play most of them.
If you look across the river, you can see the 3 Arena. Well, just to the left, you see the top of a building with a little triangular portion above the line, the roof line. That was the one that got shut down kind of 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. At one point, there were 6 coaches outside the place, and everyone piling out and kind of getting rushed in through the gates. Yeah, it was all good. There was anywhere from, it was hard to work out, but I think we had somewhere around probably 1,400 people there. And again, these just further down in the bonded warehouses that the guys hopped over. 2 lads wearing Celtic jerseys hopped over and set off all the alarms. So that's how we got rumbled.
I was kind of coming at it from, I suppose, like when I was younger, we wanted to set up raves, and we liked, we wanted to put a sound system in a field, or it wasn't about like some kind of corporation and some kind of swanky nightclub. It was about just banging out some music, and breaking the law.
The original kind of backdrop for when we did the last party, the ESB owned these huge sheds. They've been empty for quite a few years from what we could tell. Between kind of the ferryman and here, there was nothing. There were just more sheds and just the place was empty. You could be here all day, you wouldn't see a single soul. So this is a prime example of what I'd be looking for, driving around looking for new locations and trying to find, a cool spot. Each of them all had their own special feelings about them, but this one was my favorite because it was proper underground in a dirty old shed techno, and it rocked all the way through the night. Even at the end when I was arrested, I just didn't give a shit.
There was one that we held involved in, was on the quays, was on the Columbia Mill side of it, down the far side of the quays, and I remember it was an after party, so it didn't really get going till about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and I was on first, and I remember like when it started, like there was nobody there, and by the time I'd mixed my first 2 records, I looked up and the place was full because there was buses from the clubs down the quays, and everyone was brought in real military position in straight away, and off it went, and the police showed up about an hour maybe into it, and they came up, I think it was Warren Kern or Francois maybe playing at the time, and they turned the music off, and the place just went mad, and the police just kind of looked at each other and go, okay, we could have a spot problem here, and they turned the music back on, and okay lads, we'll be back at 8 o'clock and you can go until then.
And to be fair to him, I mean, there was only 8 police there, it was 2,000 people. I mean, what are they going to do about it? And to be fair to him, he said, look, just give it another hour and everything, we just call it quits then. So then he had all these ravers coming up and giving the policemen sweaty hugs and all this sort of stuff, which was quite funny, I have to say, at the time. But that was really a highlight, I think, of DJing for myself. It was just because it kind of captured the essence of what the whole rave thing was from 10 years previously.
I suppose we've always had an issue with licensing hours in this country, like, and we have this ridiculous 3 a.m. curfew in clubs. It wasn't surprising to see, that people, taking matters into their own hands and, going out and doing it and organising parties in secret locations and, in forests and mountains and fields and wherever they could find a good spot, like, to put a sound system. So it's only a pity it didn't really happen sooner, or that I think that that it hasn't happened really on a wider scale, like, than it has, like, or than it did.
At the time when I was in court, the judge said to me, the court clerk, what is the maximum fine for having a shindig of this nature without a dance licence? And the court clerk read out the fine, and it was whatever it was, 9 or 11,000 at the time, and my legs literally buckled in court. The judge told me if she saw me in court again now under such charges that I'd be going down, I'd be going inside for it. So that was kind of the last one that I put my hand up to when the authorities arrived. If you hold a dance event, whether there's booze sold at it or not, you still have to have a license to allow people to dance, which is just anathema to my whole way of thinking. To me, dance brought us together, kept people off the streets, made sure there was no crime being committed. I mean, it was part of the social life. It was intrinsic to it. So, from that point of view, I saw that we were doing nothing wrong. I mean, we had a really, really good run of it, and we were happy that it worked that way, Like, so, yeah. Police and thieves.
Do you know how grim it was growing up in the 80s in Ireland? Well, just multiply that by itself. It was fucking grim. There was nothing to do. Nothing. It was grim as hell. In the 90s, everyone kind of snapped out of that.
You wonder, I think it's going to be the job of some cultural historian or sociologist to try and divine if things like the emerging E-scene actually had something to offer, and if there was an interplay with emerging E-scene here. So there was no time for aggro or for scraps, and there was also no time for artificially making differences of people's social and economic circumstances, or even the sexual differences.
It was like two cultures. I was coming from a commercial clubbing and the things that
was getting bored with the commercial. I wanted the new, I wanted the underground, I wanted the exciting. And I came down here and I met the likes of Tony, I met Liam Fitzpatrick, I met all these people, and they were fantastic people. And then the whole sides thing started, and you're mixing the gay with the straight. But the one common denominator of everything was the music. And the fact that we were all young, well, a lot younger than we are now. We had travelled a fair bit, and we couldn't understand why Ireland was so slow with catching up with everybody else.
Look, in fairness, it was a very special period for a very short time. Sides was probably where all that moment happened, that rose-tinted fucking, you know, utopia moment happened in Sides for about a year. Then the rest was just other people's memories, you know. But there was definitely a wow moment.
Certainly by the time that I was going out, you had this definite stratification on socio-economic lines again. The disillusionment with that, you know, because it was clear that that was happening. And the disillusionment with the idea that ecstasy was this thing that was going to bring us all together. And so it became more about the music, like that you were going out to club nights not to get mad out of it. And so it became important to create a legacy, if you like, and to create something that was meaningful, that sent that message out.
Not that it deserves a mythology. In my opinion, it hasn't gone away really, you know. And what's happening now is the kids are going out and they're dancing and they're in their 20s. Majority of them go out and listen to house music still, and it's strange, you know, because 25 years ago, their parents were doing the same thing.
1991, 92, that was a whole new world for everyone in Dublin. This was something that hadn't been kind of witnessed before. And I think you hear people talking about that a lot, and it's not like it was breaking down class boundaries, but it did for a few hours on a Friday or Saturday night, maybe a few hours longer, depended. So in that sense, it was something completely new. You didn't experience that kind of social mishmash on a regular basis, apart from these kind of club events. I don't know that it exists anywhere else.
River dance, Lord of the Dance, The Commitments, Professional Dubs. River dance, Lord of the Dance, The Commitments, Professional Dubs, Professional Paddies, The Sunday Independent, The Celtic Tiger, Inner City Poverty, Heroin, Jonathan Film and Bowman.